I don't want to scare you unnecessarily, but if you're on the standard American diet, chances are you already have some insulin resistance, which leads to pre-diabetes, which then leads to type 2 diabetes. But fear not, this video addresses that. Welcome to Get It Together, and if you're new here, this channel is just me trying to figure out how to get my life together and sharing the tips and lessons I learned along the way. Now, just about 1 year ago, I did a 1-month very strict slow carb diet regimen with the goal of losing weight, losing fat. And although that first month was awesome, I lost over 20 pounds. And even after that month, continued on the slow carb diet protocol. Something happened at the tail end of 2019. It had been over a decade since I had gone to a doctor and had finally found one that was close to where I lived that was accepting new patients. And part of the process of getting a new doctor includes a full checkup, including getting blood work done. Now, despite losing more than 20 pounds in 1 month on the slow carb diet and keeping it off, what this first blood test I had in over a decade revealed was that, according to my doctor, I was dangerously pre-diabetic. This sent me into panic mode, and it's from this panic-stricken research rabbit hole that I went down that I discovered that the ketogenic diet combined with intermittent fasting can literally reverse the damage and cure pre-diabetes and even the early stages of type 2 diabetes. I think one of the scariest things that I discovered from this research, which again, likening back to the intro, I'm not trying to scare you, is that the precursor to type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, is something that isn't tested for with typical blood work. And what's been discovered is that so many people are walking around with insulin resistance and not even knowing it because their blood tests are showing that their blood glucose levels are still in the normal range. What was even more revealing is that without getting any tests done, one of the strongest indicators of insulin resistance is that when you look down and you're like me, see your belly sticking out, that is more often than not a clear indicator that we're already on our way to pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Like most of my videos on this channel, there are 3 sections to this one. Section 1 is what the real problem is. Section 2 is what the current standard treatment is and why it is so messed up. And Section 3 is taking what we learned from sections 1 and 2 and understanding why it is that a combination of the ketogenic diet combined with intermittent fasting for most people with insulin resistance, pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes is the best solution bar none. Now, before diving in, I have to remind everyone that I'm not a doctor, not pretending to be one, but I am somebody who's really OCD and I've done a crap ton of research. So let's dive into section 1, which is the real problem at hand. With no suspense or buildup, the actual problem is too much insulin. In order to really understand the scope of the problem and why there's a type 2 diabetes epidemic throughout the world today, let's do a really quick crash course on what insulin actually is and how our bodies, when normal, are supposed to interact with it. So we'll take me as an example. As a 170-pound male, I have about 1.5 gallons of blood in my body, and for those who are using metric, it's about 5.5 liters. And what's considered normal is that in all that blood, I should have just 1 teaspoon of sugar spread out throughout my entire body. Now, meanwhile, on the standard American diet, which is essentially what I've been on my entire life up till last year, folks on average are having 30 or more teaspoons of sugar every single day. Think about that. Every single day, we're having more than 30 times what should be inside of our bodies. That's obviously a problem. So continuing a little bit down the rabbit hole, to understand why this is a problem, we need to know how our bodies work in relationship with insulin. Every single time we eat and sugar, or rather glucose, enters our blood, our bodies tell our pancreas to make insulin because insulin, one of its functions, is to regulate blood sugars. Another one of insulin's functions is that it goes throughout our bodies, collecting the sugar that's in our blood, and transports that glucose into our cells so that our cells can use it as fuel. And once it sends it to our cells and our cells get topped up with that glucose, the insulin then transports the rest, some of it to our muscles, non-insignificant amount to our livers, and some to our brains. But all in all, when we're healthy, once everyone's topped up with the glucose, our cells give a signal to our pancreas to say, hey, thanks for topping us up, we're all good, you can stop making insulin now. But after years, a lifetime of having too much sugar every single day, and after the cells are filled to the brim and the insulin transport the rest of the glucose everywhere else it's needed, there's still too much sugar in our blood. And this creates a perfect storm that does 2 things. Thing number 1 is that the insulin receptors in our cells, the parts of our cells that actually accept the insulin and glucose, get blocked. And because there's sugar in our bodies and the insulin's trying to get into the cells, but the cells are rejecting it, the cells never actually give that message to the pancreas to stop making insulin. And so the pancreas just keeps making and pumping more insulin into the body. Thing number 2 is that now with excess sugar, excess glucose, excess insulin in our bodies, the insulin has no choice but to store all that excess glucose somewhere else. And where does it store it? Packs overfills our livers and then continues to spill out and stores all the excess glucose as fat. most notably as visceral fat surrounding our organs, putting pressure on our organs, and spilling out, making our bellies stick out. This is specifically why, as I said earlier, one of the key indicators that you may be insulin resistant, tracking towards prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, is if your stomach sticks out. And so as soon as thing number 1 happened, again, that's when the cell's receptors to accept glucose and insulin get blocked. That right there is insulin resistance. In other words, all the cells in our bodies are resisting insulin from working the way that it should. And if we keep on going with the same eating habits, this insulin resistance escalates to prediabetes, which then escalates to type 2 diabetes, and then eventually to potential blindness, amputation, and a whole host of other terrifying outcomes. And this, after this really quick crash course, leads us to section number 2, which is what the current standard prescriptive solution is. And the current prescribed solution is drug-based. So typically when a diagnosis of prediabetes or early stages of type 2 diabetes happens, the very first thing right now is that people are prescribed drugs like metformin, with the goal of trying to increase insulin sensitivity by forcing our blood sugars down. And this typically works for a few months up to a year, where test after test, finger prick after finger prick, blood sugars seem to normalize. But after a few months, the drugs that control the blood sugar, and this is an important point here, it just controls the blood sugar, keeps getting added to the point where the pancreas just thinks that the blood sugars are normal and stops producing enough insulin. So then after this point, the prescriptive medication escalates one step further to not only keep going on with these drugs, but then to also start adding insulin into the treatment. Think about how insane this is. So this entire pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic state happened because there was too much insulin to begin with dietarily. And after a few months to a year of temporarily improving the blood sugar readings, now we have to artificially re-add insulin, the very thing that caused the start of this disease in the first place. And the reason for this is because the very first prescription was not treating the diabetes, it was treating the blood sugar levels. And one of the most important figures who's shedding light on this entire really insane treatment protocol is a nephrologist in Toronto named Dr. Jason Fung. And one of my favorite things about his talks and his work is this whole point about the current protocol treating blood sugar levels, which is just a symptom and not the actual disease. It's not tackling the real problem, the underlying problem. He uses a different type of medical example to drive home the point. He says, our current treatment protocol is the equivalent of, let's say, for example, you get a cut, you get an injury, and then that injury starts getting infected. And because of the infection, you get a fever. And the doctor, instead of treating the injury and the infection, is just giving you Tylenol to lower your fever. That Tylenol might lower your fever, but it doesn't change the fact that you have an actual infection, and that infection is just going to keep bringing the fever back over and over again until that infection just overtakes and just keeps on spreading and causing more damage. The fever is just the symptom. The infection is the problem. Similarly to how the blood sugar levels, which the current protocol is treating, is just treating the symptom, not the actual underlying problem. Now, before continuing on to section 3, I just want to take an opportunity to thank everybody who's keeping me accountable on my Instagram. I just started my final week of the 30-day challenge where I have to post every single day to the highlights and stories, my one ketogenic OMAD meal, as well as my one 7-minute workout every single day. And if I fail to do so, the first person that calls me out gets $300. But let's move on to section 3, which is the real solution, why a combination of the ketogenic diet combined with intermittent fasting for most people in most cases of insulin resistance, prediabetes, and the early stages of type 2 diabetes is a solution that beats out any of those medications that just treat symptoms and not the actual problem. What the entire scientific medical community agrees on is that when there's too much insulin in our bodies, body fat increases, and the chances of developing metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes also increase in tandem. So instead of treating the symptom of high blood sugar levels, we should be treating the actual problem, too much insulin. So how do we tame and reduce insulin inside of our bodies? There are 2 individual ways, and the better of the 2 individual ways is to reduce the frequency of insulin spikes by going on a time-restricted or fasting protocol. And the reason for this is that literally every single time we eat anything, we spike insulin to a certain degree. Now, the second way to kind of tame insulin in our bodies is to reduce the amount of high insulin spiking foods, namely carbs and sugars. This is simply because of the 3 macros, fats, carbohydrates, and protein. Carbohydrates, by a huge margin, spike insulin the highest and fastest. If you're interested, I'll link the video right over here where I go into more detail about this. But the absolute best way to reduce insulin is to double-end it by doing both, reducing both the frequency that we spike insulin and also reducing the quantity of high insulin spiking foods. In other words, going on an ultra low carb ketogenic diet and combining that with intermittent fasting. And the best part is, without medications, combining these 2 things delivers pretty damn quick results. With my own finger pricking test, I went from pre-diabetic fasting blood sugar levels to completely normal fasting blood sugar levels inside of 3 weeks. The added benefit is that since too much insulin causes excess belly fat, reducing the insulin decreases the belly fat. Like Dr. Berg says, we don't lose weight to get healthy. We need to get healthy in order to lose the weight. Now again, I'm not a doctor, but I'm so thankful to all of the doctors who have taken a stand and provided the research and the solution. Instead of fattening their own pockets with all of the diabetes medications that they could have prescribed, they actually care about fixing the problem. Now at this point, you're either a skeptic or a believer. And if you're a skeptic, I highly recommend that you research Dr. Jason Fung on YouTube and also his 2 books, which I linked in the description below. But if you're a believer, I'll link the entire playlist that I've made sharing my journey and lessons with the combination of the ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting, because it's been a very fulfilling journey so far. If you got value out of this video, please do hit like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or want to debate anything, be sure to hit the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.